The agenda for today's call includes some quick context-setting remarks by myself and Bjorn Kleisen, the Executive Director of the Sweatfree Purchasing Consortium. Then Bob Stumberg, the lead author of the ICAR report, will share findings from his team's research. And then we'll open the floor for questions and discussion. So to set the stage just a little bit, I wanted to say a few words about why SPLC thinks that purchasers, suppliers, and public interest advocates outside of the world of U.S. government procurement should pay attention to a report that is ostensibly focused on federal procurement. And before I do that, allow me to quickly divert to introduce SPLC for our Sweatfree Purchasing Consortium attendees. We're really pleased to be co-hosting this with the Sweatfree Purchasing Consortium. The Council's mission is to support and recognize institutions for strategic leadership in understanding and taking responsibility for all of the consequences of all of their goods and services spending. Sustainable purchasing for us means addressing social, economic, and environmental impacts and opportunities within our supply chains. We're also a multi-sector and multi-stakeholder membership organization, as you can see from the list of our Founders Circle members on the right. We now have 125 member organizations with over $200 billion in purchasing power combined. We recognize the ICAR report as offering great value to our work because it closely aligns with our consensus principles for leadership and sustainable purchasing, which can be summarized as: first, seek to understand your impacts, commit to action, demonstrate real results, support innovation, and promote transparency. The authors first sought in this report to understand where the most human rights abuses are found within federal supply chains, which allow them to significantly narrow their scope to 5 key supply chains. They then analyzed the procurement process to identify a menu of practical actions that a federal agency could commit to as part of an action plan. They identified ways that federal procurement can promote innovation in the marketplace, such as by pushing for stronger standards or working with suppliers to get clean supply chains verified from beginning to end. And finally, they identified a number of ways that federal agencies can promote supply chain transparency and make meaningful use of that information to ensure that real results are being delivered. We think SPLC members from a wide variety of sectors will find the report's findings useful when piloting our Guidance for Leadership in Sustainable Purchasing version 1.0 program starting in January. While the report is focused on U.S. government procurement, private and public sector purchasers buy from many of the same supply chains analyzed by the ICAR report. And the gaps identified in the report are likely to be found in the purchasing practices of private and public sector purchasers as well. Many of the solutions the report recommends for those gaps will be similarly applicable beyond federal agencies. And while the report focuses on procurement policy, the report's authors recognize that policy changes are one piece of implementation, not a prerequisite for it. They identified many highly consequential actions that can be taken now without changes to existing policies and practices while policy work progresses. We expect purchasers in other sectors will succeed with that two-pronged implementation approach. And finally, many of the recommendations in the report can serve as meaningful indicators for tracking progress, such as % of contracts in high-risk categories that have supply chain disclosure obligations, and % of contracts in high-risk categories for which the supply chain has been disclosed. Those are just a few of the reasons and examples of the ways that we think this report could be useful and why we wanted to invite Bob to present the ICAR report recommendations. So no matter what sector or role you may be working in, we hope you find this useful. Now I'm going to turn it over to Bjorn to make a few remarks.
Yes. Thank you, Sam. I want to extend a welcome to everybody on the Sweatfree Purchasing Consortium, and especially everybody with the Sustainable Purchasing Leadership Council to this webinar. We're very excited to bring to you the topic of human rights in government procurement, and I'm especially excited to have Bob Stumberg discuss the ICAR report, because I see it as a call to action for federal agencies to take the next steps. They have begun. They should take the next steps in thinking about how to incorporate labor rights criteria and human rights criteria in international procurement especially. Because this is something I should introduce the Sweatfree Purchasing Consortium to the Leadership Council. The Sweatfree Purchasing Consortium is a network of state and local government agencies that are pooling resources, pooling data, information about supply chain to help each other buy primarily apparel products made in good working conditions. So this question of labor rights in government procurement and international labor rights in government procurement is something that state and local governments started working on in the late 1990s. The start of this movement, what we call the Sweatfree movement, can perhaps be dated to 1998 when the small town of the suburb of Cleveland called North Olmsted in Ohio, they said that they would no longer buy uniforms made in sweatshop conditions. So about around the same time that the federal government said, this was in 1999, that they would not buy products made with forced child labor anymore, just narrowing the harm to forced child labor, not looking at other abuses. Little North Olmsted, suburb of Cleveland, said they would expect their contractors to comply with domestic standards as defined in local law and international standards as defined by the International Labour Organization. That was late 1990s. Recently, we are very happy that the city of Chicago recently became the 46th city in the nation to set similar standards for its apparel contractors, along with dozens of county governments and 8 state governments. So these together have developed considerable technical expertise on how to incorporate these labor rights and human rights standards as award criteria, as contract performance requirements, and even as technical specifications sometimes. These state and local governments have learned a lot about the labor issues, the violations that are common in supply chains of different products. But as state and local governments, I think just about everybody would agree that we still struggle somewhat with 2 things. One is verification. One is follow up appropriately on the contract terms and know what is actually happening in factories around the world. And the second one is having enough leverage to actually influence human rights in complicated supply chains. And state and local governments, I would say, need the leadership of the federal government. So that's why I'm very excited about this ICAR report as a call to action to take the next steps in incorporating labor rights and human rights in international supply chains. So with that, I think I turn it back over to Sam and to Bob.
Great. Thank you, Bjorn. All right, Bob, I'm going to pass the screen controls over to you. Oops, sorry. Hang on just 1 second, Bob. I need to unmute you. Okay, we can hear you now.
Thank you, Sam. Is my screen visible?
It is.
If you haven't looked at it yet, excuse me 1 second, my own screen is not moving in the way that it should. Okay, I think it's working now. Good day, everyone. If you've not looked at it yet, you can find a copy of the ICAR report called Turning a Blind Eye at accountabilityroundtable.org on the web. ICAR's report is about respecting human rights in government purchasing, and ICAR is the International Accountability Roundtable. ICAR asked us to look at 3 issues, broadly defined, beginning with whether the government purchases from certain high-risk sectors, high risk of human rights abuses. Secondly, are there gaps in government procurement rules, gaps in the sense of protecting human rights or labor rights, and if so, are there practical solutions? So we reviewed the literature, which is building month by month, and found that there are 4 high-risk sectors that deserve particular scrutiny at this time. And by high risk, what we're talking about is the risk that there are human rights abuses in these categories: safety and risk of death, forced labor and trafficking, illegal child labor, illegal wages and hours, and finally, denial of freedoms of speech and association. So briefly, the high-risk sectors include electronic products, and that includes both the finished goods, such as computers and calculators and office machines, as well as the mineral content that goes into those goods. In fact, these are multiple sectors that flow together. So I'm summarizing on a very high level here. Our focus is on the final goods, the products themselves at this time. So you can see that in fiscal year 2013, the federal government purchased about $11.1 billion, that's B billion, of electronic products. And as you can see also, the human rights abuses occurred in every category. Second sector is logistics and security abroad. This ranges from protection of diplomatic missions to supporting troops in combat missions to, excuse me, providing security for diplomats as they travel. And the federal government purchased about $34.3 billion in fiscal year 2013 in this sector. Agriculture and seafood accounted for $6.7 billion in purchases. And finally, what I'm calling soft apparel, $1.4 billion. I'm specifying soft apparel. The actual sector is about twice this size, but soft apparel is clothing that can be made in a cut and sew factory, as distinguished, say, from high-tech aeronautical suits or body armor that uses high-tech ceramic. And while this is a relatively small percentage of all federal procurement, the important thing about the apparel sector is that these are negotiated contracts. In other words, they're contracts that can take account of non-price factors, which is very important for developing evaluation criteria to protect human rights. So shifting into the legal part of our report, we did a legal scan of the Federal Acquisition Regulation, the FAR. This is an actual snapshot of our team scanning the FAR. It's a very complicated mechanism, well over 2,000 pages of rules and contract clauses that are preset for agencies to follow. And while all of these 2,000 pages you might consider as the default or the preset, the FAR itself builds in any number of places where flexibility is provided to agencies, both in terms of the procedures they must follow and the flexibility to try out innovative approaches. So while it might be daunting in its complexity, the FAR also is inviting in the sense that it provides mechanisms for a coalition of willing agencies to innovate. We found gaps in all 5 stages of procurement. And based on our assessment, we identified 15 practical solutions which we put together in a policy menu. Those of you who are members of the Sweatfree Purchasing Consortium will notice right away that well over half of our ideas come immediately out of the experience of state and local government. I'm going to give you a sampling of just a few of the gaps in the solutions we identified. And as I jump into this, let me clarify that the solutions I'm mentioning here are just 1 or 2 of several alternatives. For every gap, there are multiple solutions. And the spirit of our approach is that there's no one way to fix a gap or to overcome a problem within the FAR. And indeed, because procurement is so complex, agencies need multiple approaches to solve these problems over the next decade or 2 if we're going to make progress. So let's jump in at stage 1. This is the stage where agencies identify what they need to purchase and what kind of risks they need to manage. And the gap here is that only one of the 5 categories, that including trafficking and forced child labor, which is part of the definition of trafficking, is clearly provided for in terms of both notice of risk and solutions within the FAR. The other categories, which I mentioned before, are not adequately addressed, and so the solution is to align procurement rules and the scope of risks that are provided for to align with other aspects of federal law. And these include import prohibitions and the Walsh-Healy Act, tariff preferences, investment programs such as the one at OPIC, the Overseas Private Investment Council, and any number of U.S. trade agreements with a labor chapter. All of these other kinds of federal laws do provide for protection of human rights in these categories. Let's go to the second stage, which is where agencies notify potential contractors of the terms of purchasing and also any non-price factors that would be used to evaluate them, and any compliance terms that would be written into the contract. So again, there's only one category that's clearly covered here, and the solution is to expand beyond that. And even without doing more work than is already being done, there are existing government reports that do a pretty good job of identifying potential abuses. For example, the Department of Labor does reports through the Generalized System of Preferences to identify countries that should not perhaps receive tariff preferences because of their abuse of human rights. And these reports go beyond the scope of just forced child labor. They cover other kinds of child labor, abuses in terms of wages and hours, threats to physical safety, and denial of fundamental freedom. At the stage of evaluating contractors, contractors are now asked with respect to forced child labor to certify that they have no knowledge of abuses, and this is based on a good faith effort to identify whether they have such abuses in their supply chains. The problem here is that contractors are essentially being asked to certify their ignorance, and so the solution is to instead ask them to certify what they should have knowledge of, that is to say, knowledge of exactly what their supply chain is, who are their subcontractors, what are the locations of their factories or other places of supply, and with respect to those places, to identify the risks, comply with local law, and provide a remedy for abuses. In other words, evaluating the supplier's capacity to undertake what you might generally think of as due diligence to avoid or remedy those risks of human rights abuses. Now, this is probably not a significant change from the current practice in the sense that if you think about what it would take to indeed provide a good faith assessment of your supply chain, it would entail these very same steps. In other words, to know what your supply chain includes, what the locations are, what the risks are, etc. So this is one area where we think agencies may well have the authority already to more clearly specify what they expect in terms of good faith assessment of risk. At the stage of awarding contracts, I'm repeating myself now, that most contracts are blind to the locations of the suppliers. They operate behind a curtain so that there's no possible accountability without knowledge of where the locations are. And compliance with law is not usually a contract obligation. And when I refer to law, I'm talking here about the law in another country, for example, the Bangladeshi Building and Safety Code. There are some interesting exceptions, though. For example, in some Defense Department contracts, there is an obligation to comply with local law. And so we use that as the template for a proposed solution, which is to insert compliance with law as a contract obligation based on the law of the place of manufacture, and to require post-award disclosure of the factory location, similar to what is done in the Sweatfree Purchasing Consortium. Finally, at the stage of enforcement, one of the gaps we identified is the contract remedies are severe. If a federal contractor is found to be engaging in violation of human rights that are now protected, the contract remedy is to suspend or debar the contractor. That's severe because it means not only would the contractor be kicked out of the federal system for 3 years, but the agency would be deprived of the services that they've already gone through a long process of securing at great expense to the taxpayers. So among the solutions here are to use remedies that are more convenient to the agency. Typical commercial remedies include withholding payments to the contractors or providing liquidated damages, for example, in the case that there are wage violations. when we talked to federal agencies immediately after issuing our report, those agencies recommended more subtle approaches, including using the existing databases for assessing contractor compliance simply by requiring the contractors to respond to contract officer requests for information or passing on complaints about failures of compliance. And because these databases stick with that contractor, not only for the life of the contract, but into the future after the contract is over, it's a fairly strong incentive for the contractors to be accountable. So I'll stop myself at that point and simply conclude by suggesting that we see the road to reform as involving stages of work. And for the project that I'm working with at Georgetown Law School and ICAR, our next stage of work will include a short-term focus on what we call a bottom-up strategy. What I mean by that is that we're looking for tweaks to contract language that could strengthen accountability under existing policy without the need to change federal rules at all, or at least not yet. One reason we're taking this bottom-up approach is because there are several federal rulemaking projects going on at the very moment. These include trafficking, discrimination against LGBT employees of federal contractors, and perhaps most importantly, the rule proposed last July in an executive order, I should say the executive order last July, which requires an extensive rulemaking process for safe workplaces and fair pay. The latter rulemaking process will require compliance with 13 U.S. labor laws. And while it sets a very important precedence for compliance with law as a condition of contractors, at the stage of evaluation of contractors, it pretty much stops at the water's edge because those 13 federal statutes do not apply to sources in other countries. So we have to respect the fact that federal agencies are very busy implementing these three important rulemaking procedures that relate to protecting human rights and labor rights. And so our bottom-up approach complements that rather than competes with it in terms of the attention of the agency. In the medium term, looking down the road a year or two, we hope to start tackling the opportunity to develop a clean supply chain. It's my personal view on this, that it would actually be easier to create a clean supply chain by identifying suppliers and certifying their ability to respect human rights and give them a recognized status in the procurement process than it would be to implement a massive command and control system that would apply to all contractors. And then in the long term, we see the opportunity to scale up rulemaking once the current rules complete the process, and we could implement our whole policy menu. So I've given you just a few examples from that menu, and as I conclude, I'll leave the menu on the screen so you can get a sense of the scope of all of our recommendations. Keep in mind that these are very high-level, abstract recommendations as written on the screen. The actual details are much more technical. So Sam, I'm going to pass it back to you. Thanks for this chance to summarize our report.
Great, thank you, Bob. So now what we're going to do is we're going to do some discussion. And to start that off, I was thinking that it would be useful. I know that we have a number of folks here from the Sweatfree Purchasing Consortium and other organizations that have been doing leadership work in this area. And I wanted to see if any of them would want to lead off our discussion time by sharing any of their experiences or anything related in terms of their thoughts or reflections on what Bob just shared and what they may have seen in reading the report themselves. So let me, I'm going to show my screen here so that I can put back up our participation instructions. Here, 1 second. Just as a reminder, if you are dialed in by telephone and would like to participate in the discussion, I would be more than happy to unmute you so that we can hear you and you can jump in the conversation. I just need to make sure that you have your audio settings correct. If you're dialed in by telephone, please switch your audio settings to telephone and type in your audio PIN. You can do it at any time. Just pound the number that you see there and then pound and that will allow me to unmute you. Next, if you want to participate, please just raise your hand or type a comment in the question box, and that'll allow me to also know that I should unmute you. Great. All right, we have a few questions that have come in. Bob, a question actually that I would love to ask you as a start off actually is, how can members of groups like the Sustainable Purchasing Leadership Council and the Sweatfree Purchasing Consortium support or engage with the ICAR project that you have going on? Is there a role for purchasers outside the federal government?
Oh, absolutely. As I said earlier, we're trying to build a set of alternatives for every gap that we identified. And so members of the SPC and the Sustainable Purchasing Leadership Council you are the ones who are trying out some of the ideas that we based our recommendations on. So you're on the front line, you're the ones with experience, and as you do this, just to take an example, is City of Madison implements its cooperative contracting, which it hopes to take the lead with other jurisdictions following on after. You're both inventing the mechanism and trying it out almost moments after you invent it. So your experience is already fed into our recommendations, and so we'd like to stay current with you. We can do that indirectly through Bjorn and the SPC, but we'd also love to be able to make a connection with you and hear from you directly. So that's one way. But another way is that for every piece of work we're doing, there are unmet roles to be played. For example, at the stage in which federal agencies identify a need for risk, we've based our initial findings on a literature review, which includes a number of primary and secondary studies of how contractors actually behave in the field. We have been able to make generalized connections between abuses of human rights in sectors such as electronics and specific suppliers who work for the federal government. However, I emphasize that these are generalized sorts of connections between government supply chains and a particular human rights abuse. What we need to do now is to drill down much more deeply and find more current and more direct evidence. And so to the extent that you have or you are developing information about specific suppliers, both positive information and negative information, we're very interested in learning that from you, not only because we need the findings of abuses, but because we need to learn about the methodology you're using to monitor compliance with your own purchasing standards. On a more abstract analytic scale, there are some organizations out there, such as the nonprofit Verite and the Aspen Institute, which are developing methodologies for risk assessment based on conditions in country. So you might think of that as a very top-down analytic approach, whereas a lot of what many of you are doing is a bottom-up analytic approach. My little project in Georgetown doesn't have the capacity, and indeed we're lawyers, we're not demographers or human rights researchers. So we need partners who can do that kind of role playing. While we focus on some legal details, you could complement our work by focusing on the actual conditions on the ground and the risk assessment methodology. That's just one example. But for every stage of the procurement process, there are unmet roles of that nature.
Very good. A question that we had come up was how to apply criteria to purchasing and contracting in purchasing and contracting with local suppliers, in particular local distributors or resellers who may not have leverage over the brands that they're reselling, to go and have demand disclosure from them. How do you think organizations can handle that?
Well, how would you handle it if you went to the department store and found that you couldn't tell whether the clothes you were buying are sweat-free or not? I would start from a very simple consumer perspective. What some people do is ask the store, where's this coming from? Do you know whether the brands that you're selling to me are following a code of good conduct? And so just by asking, you start the ball rolling. You create a model of accountability, and that is in fact how the Students Against Sweatshops got started, which eventually led to the creation of the Worker Rights Consortium and the very effective program of university logo licensing. And that in turn led to the Sweatfree communities and eventually to the Sweatfree Purchasing Consortium. So by asking questions of accountability, you start the ball rolling, and that's one approach. Just talking to your local supplier and asking them whether they know and whether they have access to information. Assuming that their answer is, we don't know much, we don't have sufficient information, I would ask you to think about why you want to work with that local supplier in the first place. Why is it that you would prefer to deal with them? Is it purely a political convenience, or is it because you appreciate the service that that local supplier can offer you and the flexibility that they give you as a purchaser? Assuming that it's the latter, that you value that business relationship, I imagine that your local supplier would be willing to work with you if you start to make more formal steps toward a system of accountability in purchasing. But it has to start there. There has to be some demand that's driving the process, and the demand should and could be more than just your agency or your university. The demand would be you plus your intermediary, the person who's providing the distribution services. Then if you start thinking on a larger scale, you can imagine a system that starts to look much more like Amazon, for example, where you have an online purchasing system for convenience, which either you can use yourself or your local distributor can be part of and can use, which allows you the opportunity to shop according to certain preset criteria, which could include compliance with human rights standards and labor rights, and the ability for maintaining a database of comments on the efficacy of those suppliers and meeting the standards. That, in fact, is what the SPC is beginning to do with its online database, which I commend to everyone. In fact, the federal government already has a massive system in place for purchasing off of government-wide schedules with multiple suppliers available to agencies. And while the ability to purchase from multiple suppliers in the federal system is not structured quite like Amazon, it is online. And it does allow for a feedback loop, and it does allow for creation of specific evaluation criteria that agencies can apply to the contractors. So I'm kind of going off the deep end here. So I'll stop at that point, but I would suggest that by beginning to think about how you would approach a local vendor just as a consumer, you can begin to understand that you can create demand from the bottom up, and you can also at the same time work with the SPC or federal agencies to think about how to adapt the systems that they're putting in place.
Sam, I'm not sure, can I be heard? Can I add a comment on that question?
Bjorn, we can hear you.
Okay, great. This is Bjorn. I just wanted to, this is a very important question about how to work with local distributors, and we got several comments on that one. I got written comments, from the city of Portland, which is one of the cities that are doing very, very good work on engaging with suppliers on this topic. They raised this question too. How they said how, and I'm voicing it for them because unfortunately they were not able to join. But here's the question: how meaningful is it to evaluate the capacity of the local distributor to manage their supply chain for the purpose of compliance with human rights? Again, when they don't have the control of the supply chain, and I think that what Bob is saying is entirely correct. That it simply starts with the question. It starts with a request and with a demand, and by doing that, state and local governments have been able to pass down the demand through the supply chain that brands should be accountable for human rights and should respect the human rights of the workers in the supply chain. However, I think that looking at it from a different point of view is to look at the distributors as your partners in this process. Not rather, and then go to them and say, how can we help you to address human rights in supply chain? We know you're a very small partner, so what tools do you need from us to help? And we have done this to a very limited extent, but we often find local distributors who are want to do something about the human rights violations in supply chain and are very eager to do it when they know how to do it. So I think that in many cases we could see local distributors as being very willing partners. We just need to make it possible for them to engage on this issue.
Great. So I want to take advantage. We've got a lot of questions coming in and good comments as well. I do just want to make sure before we get going too far that we invite in an important voice in this conversation. We're pleased to have the U.S. General Services Administration as a member of the Sustainable Purchasing Leadership Council, and we're also fortunate to have Jed Ela from GSA. He's the Sustainability Coordinator for GSA on the line with us. So I'd like to ask Jed a question, which is, when you read the ICAR report, what were a few takeaways for you in your role as Sustainability Coordinator for the U.S. General Services Administration and for your work with GSA?
Thanks, Sam. I think my biggest takeaway, probably other than that this is a great report and a great read and a very thought-provoking piece for any practitioner in this area, is we have a lot of work to do within federal agencies to incorporate some of this stuff. And I think there are a lot of great recommendations here. One of the reasons I say we have a lot of work to do is I have been working within the Federal Acquisition Service and GSA for the last 4 years or so, working in questions very, very much like these, but limited to the environmental sustainability area, and working with innovative procurements and disclosure, and working with suppliers, and how do we treat them as partners, and all the same questions that we've been talking about here, and really doing those innovative procurements that put stuff into practice more in the environmental realm. And the executive order that came out earlier this year, as well as the update on LGBT, so those two items, when they came out, let me know just how siloed some of this process is, because anyone in the private sector, in the corporate world, is working on sustainability is going to tend to be aware of sustainability as the three-legged stool, of course. And here I have been working on many of these very same sorts of structural issues on environment, but had no awareness through policy channels that this work was being done and this policy was coming out on social aspects of sustainability. So I think one thing that we need to work on more in the future is, to the extent that these require the same sorts of processes within the agency and the same sorts of accountability and transparency mechanisms and innovative procurement strategies and that sort of thing, all of us working on all sides of the federal community probably need to help work on breaking down silos and making sustainability a more unified field the same way it is in the private sector. On the detailed recommendations for different parts of the procurement process and so forth, I had a number of reactions, probably more than I can go through in just a couple of minutes, and I don't want to crowd people out, but I think that one thing to keep in mind is that with any recommendation that affects the procurement process, I think the report touches a number of times on the need for more legal research and legal hurdles and legal authorities and that sorts of things. When it comes down to it, trying to put this stuff into practice within an agency, the sort of day-to-day business questions end up being much bigger hurdles. What is the effect of this on the availability of goods, of having higher standards on the availability of the goods that we need? What's the effect on internal staffing of putting new processes for checking these things in place? I don't frankly believe that price effects are as big as many people make them out to be, but at least in the environmental side, looking for greener products, we spend an enormous amount of time trying to reassure people that what we might try to do in looking for more sustainable products is not going to lead to prices, out the window. So I think those kind of practical questions are just, you have to understand the effects. And I think the kind of road to reform roadmap that Bob put up in one of the last slides, I think right on. I think you have to start small, start with existing contracts, start with contracts that are coming up for renewal, start with particular language, particular commodities where there's high risk or opportunities, and then move up. And I think the idea of doing pilots that put contract vehicles in place specifically to offer sweat-free type of products and products that are sustainable in whatever aspect one might be interested in is a great second move. And then sort of that higher policy piece being a much more slow-moving process. So I'll leave it at that. I guess the only other comment that I would have on detailed stuff is, at least in the federal arena, at least at GSA, and it may be limited to GSA, but I sort of doubt it. I think it's much easier to talk about putting evaluation factors in place and using evaluation factors as sort of a best value process. It's much easier to talk about that in theory than it is to do it in practice. And my experience in doing detailed implementation of this in major federal contracts on the environmental side the last few years is that you're much better off from a perspective of both internal staff time and efficiency and getting actual behavior change from contractors to just figure out what it is you can require as a baseline requirement and require it rather than trying to use evaluation factors. Evaluation factors, I think, we've used them sometimes. People talk about it, frankly, as a sort of signaling. It becomes very difficult to decide how to apply them. And part of the reason for that is, at least at GSA, we don't tend to do very many procurements where there's a set number of points for different factors. A lot of people are under the impression that we do, and it may be that, at other agencies they do many more like that, but very often at GSA, by the time the decision is made to do a best value evaluation, we say we care about quality first, price second, past performance third, and that's it. And if you want to throw in sustainability in there, you can throw it in as we care about it, ranked third or something like that. It's very easy to basically overlook it when it comes time to actually pick your contractor. So I'll leave it at that.
That was a lot of great thoughts, Jed. I am sure that there are many people on the phone who are not just in the private sector, not just in federal agencies, but also in the private sector and other public agencies that can relate to many of the things, particularly the bifurcation of the human rights and social aspects of sustainable procurement from environmental aspects. I'd like to read something here from Melissa Borderline at the City and County of Denver. She wrote that they include sweatshop language in which the distributor is responsible for providing authorized distributorship and obtaining statements from the manufacturer. Sorry, I'm getting some feedback. I'm going to see if there's anyone I can mute. Okay. Sorry about that. I hope no one else is getting that. So the City and County of Denver includes sweatshop language in which the distributor is responsible for providing authorized distributorship and obtaining statements from the manufacturer line proposed with regards to their supply chain and compliance to the sweat-free language. So there is an example of leadership that you can look forward to, and I'm sure if you go to the City and County of Denver website or type in Google for Melissa Borderline, she can give you plenty more information about that. We have, let's see here, we have Ted. Can I call on you now? I need Ted here. Ted, we can hear you now.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. I had just submitted a question because I've been working in the electronics arena for a long time, and this previous speaker said there's a lot more development of criteria, purchasing criteria in the environmental field than there is in the human rights and health and safety fields, which I think is really important to develop. And I just want people to be aware that there is a growing awareness that these are underdeveloped fields. There currently is no sweat-free electronics available, and it's really a long way from where we are to where we need to go. But there are several different processes ongoing right now trying to develop these kinds of criteria. And if people have suggestions or are interested in participating, I'd like to be able to develop a connection to, encourage participation in that.
Great. Ted, you want to tell folks your organization and how they can get in touch with you?
Yeah, sorry. I am the coordinator of the International Campaign for Responsible Technology. I'm based in San Jose. We have a website, which is just www.icrt.co. My email is tsmith@igc.org, and I would welcome suggestions that people have. We're particularly interested in learning from people in the garment industry that have been working on these issues a lot longer than we have been on electronics, and are very interested in doing some collaborative exploration in that field.
Right. All right, I'm going to combine two questions here. One from Linda Rankin at Province of Nova Scotia, and another one also from the City and County of Denver. The question was about how can you verify what a company is doing in another country with regards to labor standards and practices and violations. And then Melissa asked, what liquidated damages language can you utilize with regards to exercising sweat-free compliance throughout the life of the contract? So I guess, first of all, you need to know how to figure out how to confirm, how do you verify what's happening abroad, and then how can you hold an organization accountable for that in your contracts? Robert, I'm going to unmute you in case you want to take a stab at that. And
I'll take a stab, and then I'll hopefully draw Bjorn into this conversation. As Linda implies, it's really tough to assess legal compliance in another country. That's one reason why Verite is working under a contract from the Department of Labor to use more of a top-down approach that does a broad assessment of the legal environment of the country, the capacity of agencies to enforce their own laws, the adequacy of those laws themselves, although most countries have adequate laws, it's the enforcement that's a problem. And then the history of abuses that's been already documented in terms of particular sectors. So in the absence of company-specific information or faculty-specific information, you still can use these broader methodologies for assessing risk. That said, there needs to be a way to do sampling or audits of particular companies and supply chains within certain provinces or countries. That sampling approach has its critics, but the Fair Labor Association, among others, uses that to some effect. It's certainly better than not having a system in place at all. And then, of course, having a mechanism for eliciting worker complaints is very important and controversial to the extent that it's not, no matter what you say, when you ask workers to reveal the abuses of their employers, they put themselves at risk, even often in a unionized circumstance. So through a combination of those approaches, I think you can begin to get at the problem. I don't want to, for a minute, minimize the difficulty, however, of identifying abuses to a specific supply chain.
Great. All right, and let me just unmute Robert Ross real quickly. Robert, was your comment related to this question?
Yes, it was. Hi, hello, Bob Stumberg. This is Bob Ross.
Hey, Bob.
It occurs to me, listening to that last exchange, that in the medium to long run, one very important area of address when thinking about any government, but in particular federal government procurement, is to build up local capacity to do their own law enforcement. It seems to me it's a whole area of foreign aid in which we should see ourselves as, I'm thinking in particular now of Bangladesh, of building up the capacity of labor ministries and the relevant safety inspectorates to enforce their own laws. That's my comment.
If I could just briefly respond to Bob, it's a tough road, you know. In Bangladesh, the Association of Apparel Manufacturers reacted very strongly against the progress being made by the Accord for Building and Fire Safety. And even though the Accord committed its members to help finance the improvements in factories, the Association of Manufacturers put pressure on the government, which turned around and accused union organizers of being unpatriotic, of undermining the country's reputation. So that's the kind of political climate you're up against in some countries. It's very difficult. So we have to understand that this is going to be a road that requires persistence. And I think the lesson from the Accord is that you need to have some empathy for the position of the manufacturers as well. And their immediate pushback was twofold. It was both political, as I just said, but also economic. They basically said, look, if you want to hold us accountable, fine, but where are the financial resources that you would expect us to use to bring our factories into compliance? And that indeed was, I think, one of the leading innovations of the Accord. It put the large purchasers online for providing the financial mechanism to undertake these sometimes structural and expensive building repairs. And as Bob Ross just said, that's where foreign aid comes in. The United States can provide a financial mechanism. At the same time, government purchasers start making demands on the supply chain. I don't think, unless you look at both the financing for remedy at the manufacturer level and demand-driven reform, unless you do both of those at the same time, you're gonna, I think, be stalled by the political resistance.
I want to make sure the question about liquidated damages gets addressed. Bjorn, is that something that you'd want to address? And you'll need to unmute yourself before we can hear you. Oops. And look, on my side, it's showing that that you've muted yourself, which I actually can't undo. Bob, sorry, is that something you would want to address?
The model for liquidated damages is an idea we took from the existing federal acquisition regulation. It's provided as a remedy in the domestic context where a supplier, for example, a construction company, fails to pay overtime to its workers. And so the remedy in the FAR is that if you're found to have violated that contract obligation to pay overtime according to the law, then the remedy is liquidated damages. It's a certain, I think it's like $10 per hour per violation. I forget the exact number, but it's very specific and clear so that the contractors know what the remedy is ahead of time. And the remedy can be adjusted based on the pay scale of the country and the conditions of manufacture. The difficult problem is, as Linda mentioned earlier, is being able to actually have the factual evidence that a contractor has failed to pay the wages. To get that, you're going to need boots on the ground. You're going to need people who can go interview the workers.
Okay, great. And another question that actually, in terms of sort of boots on the ground, someone asked, how can you connect purchasers with the workers in terms of making sure that the experience of workers is something that I guess the purchasers are aware of and are able to respond to? How can you engage workers in monitoring and enforcing workplace human rights?
Sam, this is Bjorn. If I heard your last question. Can I be heard right now?
Yes.
Oh, great. I'm sorry, I don't know. I just managed to unmute myself. Okay. I wanted to, on that topic and on the question of verification, of course, it's a key question. Good that it's raised. You know, in the first place, work with suppliers to ensure that to minimize risk of violations by ensuring they have the capacity to address violations in supply chain. That's a very short Part A answer. Part B is exactly right. There's no way to verify without boots on the ground, but boots on the ground does not necessarily mean that we should be do top-down audits or that we should be relying on spot checks, because it's entirely possible to work with a large network of local labor rights organization of different kinds. They may be trade unions, they may be legal services organizations. They are organizations in producer regions that are experts on this topic and have good relationships with workers. That means by working with this network of sort of local monitors, we can actually have a continuous information flow, get information in real time about abuses that happen in factory or allegations that need to be investigated. It is possible to get accurate information, to get thorough information, and to verify that, and to do so in a cost-effective way without being completely reliant on the typical industry audit model. So there are ways of doing it. Verification is a good question, but it's not a question without an answer, especially not with a collaborative engagement. And in terms of bringing in the workers, there are no better monitors than workers themselves. If workers are not afraid of speaking up, which they often are, but are protected when they speak up, can speak up in secure settings, and can are empowered to express their views and demand remedies, that is actually a very, very cost-effective way of verification and of doing responsible purchasing.
And Bjorn, we need to wrap up, but I do want to note the Sweatfree link-up database that you have, and the idea that disclosure is a prerequisite for what you just described. If you don't know the factories where your things are being made, you don't know which workers to be listening to or listening for. Similarly, workers, if they don't know who is purchasing from the factory, don't know who to tell. And so the Sweatfree Consortium's Sweatfree link-up database, I hope I'm representing this accurately, is intended to help bridge that gap. If you're a purchaser and you get the disclosure of your factory locations, you're able to report those through this database publicly, which then workers and worker advocates can then find you to let you know if there are abuses that you should be aware of. You can get access to audit reports that other organizations have done and so forth. Anything to correct there, Bjorn? Feel free.
No, that's great. Thank you.
Super. So I want to thank everyone for tuning in today. It's been really thought-provoking. A couple of announcements just to keep you tuned in before we go. We have a webinar coming up from another webinar for the Sustainable Purchasing Leadership Council on Friday. It's a briefing for the public about opportunities to participate in our Guidance version 1.0 pilot program, which, as I mentioned earlier, will be kicking off in January. But the expression of interest period is open now, and some orientation meetings are happening now, including this one on Friday. You can find out more about it at the URL there, sustainablepurchasing.org/community. Secondly, we will be having our summit in May in Seattle for the Sustainable Purchasing Leadership Council. And I wanted to make sure I mentioned to you that our super early bird pricing ends this Friday, $200 off. So if continuing conversations like these with a multi-sector, multi-stakeholder group that's trying to connect the three legs of the sustainability stool within procurement is something of interest to you, those are exactly the types of conversations we're having and will be having there. Bjorn, do you have any announcements for the Sweatfree Purchasing Consortium?
I'd be happy to follow up on these conversations with anybody who would like to do so, and we can take it from there. And there are forums within the Sweatfree Purchasing Consortium where these questions can be further discussed. I heard comments, terrific comments from everybody today. Very interesting comments from the GSA and from Nova Scotia and from Denver. and I welcome opportunities to discuss these questions further in upcoming forums, and people can contact me about how to do that.
Great. And to that point, we got several other questions we weren't able to ask. Maybe we will be able to get answers to those in an email that we'll send out with the recording. So thank you, everyone. Thank you all so much for your time. Have a great day. And I also want to make sure to thank Bob so much for all his hard work on this report and his team, and also being available today to share it with us. Thank you so much, Bob.